The horrific murder of 8 massage parlor employees, including 6 Asian women, has sparked a massive outcry and a lot of concerns about what is leading to a spike in Asian violence.
So joining us now to discuss, friend of the show and journalist Zaid Jilani recently wrote an op-ed in Newsweek saying, quote, "We can't stop anti-Asian violence until we're honest about it." So give us the honesty, Zaid. What is happening here in America?
Yeah, so it's actually a good question because I don't think we have all the facts about what exactly is happening. For instance, I think we know that there was a spike in sort of bias-related incidents or hate crimes early last year, I think with the onset of the pandemic. We saw, I think, maybe some political rhetoric, but also just in general during pandemics, societies tend to tighten, cultures tighten. You tend to see more prejudice. I think that's a historic fact, and it wasn't too surprising to see that. What's happening right now may be a little bit different. If you follow a lot of the high-profile crimes that have happened, Bay Area, New York City, now we have Atlanta, it's not 100% clear that they're all going to be charged as hate crimes. In order for something to be charged as a hate crime, the person who commits the crime has to some way signal or openly declare some intention about some kind of motivation, racial or ethnic hatred, so on and so forth. And in many of these cases, that's not actually what's happening. A lot of the robberies, assaults, those sorts of things, they could just be like the normal sort of economic crimes and those sort of things that Asians happen to be impacted by as well. We had something like 5,000 extra murders last year. We've had a huge surge in violent crime that's barely gotten covered. But I think when it's happening to Asians, people are seeing a pattern. And, they're declaring it as possibly a racist motive. I think that it's possible that they're not all explicitly hate crimes, but Asians are seen as easy targets because of stereotypes about being, meek or reticent or foreign or not having, immigration status. Also, Asians are sometimes seen as well-to-do. So I think this is one reason that a lot of common criminals may target them. In terms of what happened in Atlanta, it does seem like it may be a hate crime, but maybe not a racially motivated hate crime, right? Georgia's new hate crime law also applies to gender-based violence, and it seems, at least from the few initial stories we have on this, that perhaps the person was motivated by some perverse sexual beliefs or he was deeply reactionary, religious, that sort of thing. So I think we have to look at these crimes on a case-by-case basis. But I think certainly one thing that's true is that it's not true that there's a white supremacist-led, there's not a white supremacist wave of terrorism or hate crimes or anything like that. In many of these cases, the criminals in question are not even white to begin with, let alone white supremacists. And I think a lot of this really is just that we saw a huge surge in violent crime in the cities over the past year. And Asian Americans have, for a number of reasons, been the targets of that. Partly because I think they're seen as easy targets, and partly because they're seen as a little bit more well-to-do. And I think on average in these cities, most of these Asian American populations, for instance, the Chinatown in San Francisco and Oakland, they're not actually that well off, but they may be slightly more well off than your average criminal, right? So you kind of see that dynamic where there is a lot of good research showing that Asian Americans tended after 1965 immigration reforms, 1966, 1965, there were a lot of Asian Americans who moved into cities and started businesses, right? And I think that a lot of people who lived in those cities saw it as a driver of gentrification, taking economic spots that sometimes they felt were owed to them. The sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that you see among Americans of all backgrounds, where they feel like they're in competition with other people who are maybe slightly better off than they are. And unfortunately, I think that has impacted Asian Americans over the years. It is something that eventually led to violence in Los Angeles in the early 90s and led to citywide boycotts in the early 1990s in New York City. And I think a lot of those dynamics are what's happening now. And it's not clear to me that there is actually a surge in actual racially motivated hate crimes right now, although there probably was last year when the pandemic was starting, although it's not clear that it's continued now. The best way for us to know is when the FBI will compile its uniform crime report on hate crimes, which will take a year or two actually to get through 2021. Maybe we can look back at it and see. But really what I would say is that if you look at most of these crimes that are happening, it's really a matter of policing, right? It's a matter of protecting people who are vulnerable. So many of the attacks are against elders, against elderly people. And, criminals see them as people that they can pick on and they can rob and assault with not really being able to fight back. And I think that's really, it's largely a policing question at this point, I would say. That isn't to say that there's no racially motivated hate crimes. There are certainly examples of people making comments about coronavirus, saying go back to Asia, that kind of thing, or you need to put in your place, that kind of thing. But I do think that, when you're talking about violent crime, you kind of have to deal with it in the way that you deal with violent crime, which is, not leaving these elderly people to fight for themselves, but actually having decent policing and public safety. So.
Yeah, well, and that's part of what has been so shocking, I think, to people is seeing these defenseless elderly people being assaulted. And there's a lot that's really uncomfortable about this conversation. One of the things that's uncomfortable is the dynamic that you touched on there and also touched on in your piece, that there's a history of tension sometimes between minority groups. And that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And you lay out what, at least historically, where some of that tension has come from, which is you've got people who are poor in largely black communities who see Asian immigrants coming in and doing somewhat better than they are, although they're still working class and they're still struggling, which speaks to an overall sort of system of oppression that keeps people poor and makes it difficult for everyone, pits them ultimately against each other. Speak a little bit to that dynamic here.
Yeah, I think this is very important, that I think when a lot of people would see, like, for instance, a Korean or Iraqi or South Asian or whatever have you move into a neighborhood, and maybe they'll buy a corner store, they'll buy a 7-Eleven, and so on and so forth, they'll own these things. They'll see them as competition, and in some sense they are competition. They're competition to local businesses and local workers. But I think, it goes into the same dynamic you see with anti-immigrant sentiment, in that, yes, it does produce certain stressors on a community, but those people are only slightly maybe better off than you in some circumstances, right? Really, you and them have more in common with each other than you might have with, like, a Jeff Bezos, right? Or a Bill Gates, or the head of Nike or Disney, or one of these larger corporations who are running brands and big box stores that are putting everybody out of business, right? That are monopolizing the economy and sucking up opportunity and hope in these places. So I think it's very important, to the extent that we can mobilize any kind of social factors. I think it's very, very important to stress to people that, yes, immigration does produce certain amount of competition in the economy that can be adverse, particularly for low-income people. And I think that's a question for policymakers, right? It's not really a matter of something you should take out on individual immigrants, because all they're trying to do is the same thing you're trying to do, right? Just get a small toehold in this economy and do right by their families, build a business, actually, do something to put food on the table. If you look at the median income in, like, Chinatown and Oakland and San Francisco, it's actually very low. It's actually, like, one of the poorer communities in that area.
Right.
It's the tech bros, it's Silicon Valley. It's those people who are really driving up rents, who are really, in many cases, monopolizing parts of the economy. Those are the people who are really making off like bandits. But I think a lot of poor people never even see that. Like, you don't come into contact with them. They don't even live in the same social circle. So I think some people may get resentful towards what they see on their street corner, but they're not going to get resentful towards Jeff Bezos, because they're never going to see Jeff Bezos, right? Even though Jeff Bezos is much more of the reason why people are poor or not being paid decently, don't have a space for their business to compete, than the person who comes from India or South Korea or something to start a business. And I do think it's something that should be noted, is that if you look at the statistics, Asian Americans are much more likely to be victimized by other members of minority groups than any other minority group is. And I think that's almost entirely due to this economic dynamic of where they happen to settle, where they made businesses, and stereotypes about them being kind of, well-to-do or being a quote-unquote model minority, even though, as I just stated, in reality, they're only most Asian Americans maybe will be doing, in these places anyway, might be doing a little bit better than the surrounding community, but not necessarily a whole lot. But yeah, putting all these things together can be a really toxic combination. However, I do think it's something that can be addressed through, I think, better policing to stop the crime, and also just better community relations. Just having people come to the realization that even if they're not in an entirely even place economically, they still have more in common with each other than they do with some of the big kahunas out there. It's just that you don't necessarily see those people, and that's how poor people get pitted against each other. So
I think such an important point, really nuanced. I encourage everybody to go read your piece. Zaid, thanks for joining us, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Coming up, journalist and author Alec MacGillis. He's going to discuss his new book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. That's when Rising returns.